where in the New Testament do you find the sacrifice of the Mass? And I said, well, to answer that another way, let's look at Luke 22, where we find the only occurrence of where Jesus ever used that phrase, kainaidia theike, New Testament, New Covenant. Because I said, if you look carefully at what the New Testament says about the New Testament, you'll notice, Chris, it never calls itself the New Testament. In fact, Jesus only uses that phrase, New Testament, once in Luke 22, but what is he referring to? He says, this is the cup of my blood, the blood of the New Testament, New Covenant, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me. Do this. What is this? This is the Eucharist. And what is the Eucharist? The Eucharist is the New Testament. The Eucharist is the only thing Jesus ever called the New Testament. I said, Chris, the New Testament was a sacrament long before it started to become a document. According to the document. The New Testament never calls itself the New Testament, but it shows us that the only thing Jesus called the New Testament was the Eucharist when he instituted it. And what does he say? This is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the New Testament, poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. And then what does he say? Write this in memory of me. Oh, no, wait. He didn't say write this. He said, read this in... No, he didn't say that either. What did he say? He said, do this. And guess what? They all went out doing the Eucharist, preaching the gospel, baptizing new converts, and then the breaking of the Eucharistic bread as we read in Acts 2:42. I said, but as a matter of historical fact, over half of the 12 disciples in the upper room that night never ended up contributing a single book to the collection of 27 that we now call the New Testament, but not because they were disobeying orders, but because Jesus didn't order them to write this in memory. He told them to do this, and all of them went out doing it, whereas less than half of them ended up writing any books that are now in the New Testament. But I said, this explains why the church grew and celebrated the Eucharist everywhere it went for years and years before the New Testament books were even begun. I said the New Testament books started getting written 15, 20 years at the earliest after Jesus died and rose. But the church wasn't sitting around waiting and wondering, what are we supposed to believe? Why won't one of you 12 sit down and write some Gospels or some epistles? Because Jesus never wrote anything. He never commanded them to write anything. But what he did and commanded them to do is what they did and what Christians still do. And it's the only thing Jesus ever called the New Testament. And not just Jesus, but years before Luke wrote his Gospel, Chris, Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And in 1 Corinthians 11, we find the earliest reference to that thing called the New Testament. And there again, what is Paul referring to? The night he was betrayed. He took bread. And then after supper, he took the chalice. And what does he say? This is the cup of my blood, the blood of the New Testament. For Paul, for Luke, for Jesus, the New Testament was a sacrament long before it started to become a document. And that's what we find in the document. I said, Chris, I discovered that if I want to be a New Testament Christian, I'm going to end up having to become a Catholic, a Eucharistic Catholic, in following the New Testament. So to answer my old question that you put back to me, where in the New Testament do you find the sacrifice of the Mass? Chris, the sacrifice of the Mass is the New Testament, according to the New Testament. It's like a sign that points beyond itself. Like this morning when I took off for the Pittsburgh airport. I finally got there. I saw the sign that said Pittsburgh Airport, and next to it, it had the number 14. So what did I do? I pulled over and I waited for my plane. No, I didn't. I drove 14 more miles until I got to that which the sign was signifying and pointing to. The New Testament is a wonderful document, but it's like a sign that points to the sacrament. The only thing Jesus calls the New Testament, he institutes as a sacrifice. And so if we're going to be New Testament Christians, we better be Eucharistic Catholics. I remember mentioning to him, you know, in our family we've got several movies that are like family favorites. There's one old one called Princess Bride. I said, you know, my kids never get tired of giving me these lines. You know, I don't think that word means what you think it means. In the movie, I think it's inconceivable. I said, Chris, you keep using that phrase, New Testament. I don't think that phrase means what you and I thought it meant, because the New Testament uses that phrase referring to the Eucharist. The sacrifice of the Mass is the New Testament, according to the New Testament, whereas the New Testament books weren't begun for about 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, but they weren't completed until the late 90s of the first century, near the end. And I said, what's so interesting is that everywhere in the first century, you read the documents of the New Testament, what they're calling the New Testament is not literature, but liturgy. It's the sacrifice of the Mass. It's what Jesus called the New Testament. And I said, another discovery I made in the process of becoming Catholic is that the very first time you hear the phrase, the books of the New Testament, is an anonymous document written around 190 A.D. Around 190, people are being taught how to prepare for Sunday worship, and they're being taught how to prepare by getting ready to listen to the books of the New Testament. But I said, even then, Chris, they weren't calling it the New Testament yet, because the Eucharist is the New Testament, and it's the climax of the liturgy, but the first half of the liturgy is the liturgy of the Word, followed by the liturgy of the Eucharist. And since the Eucharist is the New Testament that comes after we read these books, we'll call these books the books of the New Testament. This was a liturgical collection, a liturgical document to be read in preparation for celebrating a liturgical sacrament. But the sacrament is the New Testament. And I said these books weren't canonized. The table of contents wasn't finished until around 380 A.D., near the end of the 4th century, when the table of contents that we call the New Testament canon was completed in Rome. I said at the same time the New Testament canon was ratified, the Roman canon, the Eucharistic prayer, was ratified. And it wasn't a coincidence. The church was rendering its liturgy united. It was a united Mass. So we'd all agree on the New Testament as the liturgy and the New Testament as literature. I said, Chris, I want you to spend some time thinking about what it means to call yourself a New Testament Christian. And another week went by. I just kept piling on. You know, I realized after 3 or 4 weeks that we needed to kind of just talk about family and friendship and past experiences and all of the rest. And so I sent him a box of books instead. 5 or 6, like the Lamb's Supper and Lord Have Mercy and other things too. You know, and then we went through a period of relative silence. In fact, he went incommunicado for a few months. And I began wondering, maybe I just went a little too far, pushed a little too hard, like my mom always tells me that I do. I have no idea what she's talking about. You know, and then one day, out of the blue, on a Saturday afternoon, I got a phone call, and I could see on my cell phone the caller ID was Chris. Hey, Chris, long time no hear. What you up to? Oh, Carol and I are just having a great afternoon. I'm like, what are you doing? Well, funny you'd ask. You know, just last week, after finishing the Lamb's Supper and discovering that the Eucharist really is totally scriptural, we read that book, Lord Have Mercy. And we're driving home from having gone to confession for the first time in more than 30 years. I'm like, whoa, that's and you're in a good mood? Well, yeah, but, you know, not just because of all the sins that we had to come up with, but because tomorrow we get to receive Holy Communion for the first time in more than 3 decades, and we can't wait. And I got to tell you, all I could say was, thanks be to God, you just made my year. And he's like, and God made ours. We're coming home. When I hung up with Chris, I discovered that the new evangelization is not just some theoretical program. It is the practical reality of living the experience of friendships. Friendships from the past that are renewed in the present, in the context of a shared experience, but also to share the Eucharist, to re-evangelize the de-Christianized, the de-Catholicized, but in the context of friendship. A short while later, Chris flew up from Florida to Pittsburgh. We spent hours together. He's done it twice more. And now he's turning around and helping one of his friends, his best friend from high school and college, who has drifted away following his wife into a fundamentalist anti-Catholic church. He's now sharing all about the New Testament being a sacrament long before it starts to become a document. I have no patent on this because this is public domain. This is what all of us believe. This is who we are as Catholics. This is what we do. And it doesn't in any way demean the New Testament. It doesn't devalue the 27 books that we call the New Testament. If anything, it endows them with a certain sacramentality. Because when you read the Bible from the heart of the church, when you read the New Testament literature in light of the liturgy, it comes to life not less but far more for us as Catholic Christians, as New Testament Christians, as Eucharistic Christians,